house, and if any Indian tries to stop me, I'll blast him.
You know, the only thing more pathetic than Indians on TV is Indians watching Indians on TV.
Hey everybody, it's Ian, back again for another episode of Native Film Talk. Today's a fun episode. I'm talking about Real Injun, the documentary directed by Neil Diamond, which really is the whole purpose I started this. When I first saw the documentary Real Injun, it changed the way I looked at film. I initially took a class in my undergrad, my first class at college. It was called Native Americans in Film and Television. And that changed the way I looked at movies, changed the way I looked at film, and really made me look at things differently. It was in the Native American Studies department, and it was a kind of upperclassman course. There wasn't a whole lot of freshmen in there. And so I think it was a great introduction for me to be introduced to critical conversations about representation and see things like Pocahontas, Dances with Wolves, Last of the Mohicans, movies I grew up watching, but with a very different lens, and have a specific like academic kind of twist on things, which allows you to have more informed conversations about how representation frames people's mindsets and ideas of who Native people are. Because I grew up in an environment where I was the majority. I was never truly a minority until I went to college. I grew up on the reservation, and in my high school, in my town, we were the dominant demographic. Like, it was 95% Navajo pretty much everywhere I went. You know, town of like 10,000-ish people. So until I went to college, and I went K through 12 in that program in my hometown. So until I went to college, that was really one of the first times I ever really was like a minority of the minority population, because this Native student body was so small. So it felt so interesting to be in a classroom where you're talking about representation in film and television, and I'm like, what? That's how people think of Natives? That's how people process information around Native people? That's what frames their mindsets? And I think in that class, coupled with Real Injun, I'm like, well, that's how my mindset was framed too. You know, I joke about being a lame Indian, you know, and thinking I was a lame Indian because we didn't ride horses, we didn't shoot bow and arrows, we didn't have war bonnets, we didn't live in teepees. I was like, we freaking live in hogans, like we're boring, we suck, you know. We don't have the cool teepees like in television. We don't shoot bow and arrows, like on TV, like in the westerns, and you know, I just didn't feel represented on screen, and so like I never associated myself as Native, as like Indian, quote unquote. I just was like, well, I'm Navajo, because the natives that are on TV are different. I'm not the same as them, even though like the overall blanket term, Native American, Indigenous, Native, American Indian, whatever term, is what I was under. I never associated myself as that. And it was interesting how I was separate from that, but also as I matured and came to terms with like American Indian, Native American identity, kind of in your indigeneity, I started thinking a lot of the things that Neil Diamond talked about in Real Injun, of just like, wow, I suck, you know? Like the natives that are represented on TV, the very stereotypical images, like I'm not that. Why am I not that? And so today, you know, I had a good conversation with Kaylee and Kara about that, because they run a podcast called Twindigenous. They are twins. They are fraternal twins. And they started their podcast to just talk about, from a twin perspective, you know, their experiences growing up Native and kind of their interactions with popular culture. And they talk about that. But they also are theater actors. And this particular documentary resonated with them when they first saw it. And it changed their life. They were just like, gosh, I recommend this to everybody, because it's such a great opportunity for people to learn, both Native and non-Native. I think that's what I love about Real Injun. I think right now the difficulties, it's so hard to find, to watch, but it's so educational. It discusses the complicated history of Native representation in film and television in such a concise way that you're like, how did they manage to just educate me with so much information in such a short amount of time? And it has great interviews with people like Adam Beach and Charlie Hill. You know, the Charlie Hill interview segments are my favorite part. And then the John Trudell interview segments, of course. And I think that all of those perspectives rolled into one really helps you understand, like, it's complicated. Native representation in film and television is complicated. There is no one perspective, and depending on who was represented at the time, you have a different perspective of those Native people, even as a Native person. And I think it's really interesting. And we kind of talking a little bit about that nuance in our interview, but mostly we just kind of hang out and discuss, and, we don't really know each other too well. We do now, obviously, but it was just a good time to talk to a couple other natives about this film, because it's hard to find people who have seen Real Injun. And when you do find those people that have seen Real Injun, you're just like, yes, I get to talk about this with somebody else. You get to just fan over this movie, and it's a lot of fun. So if you have never seen Real Injun, directed by Neil Diamond, if you can find a way to watch it, highly encourage you to go watch it. There's a website. The website's still up, realinjun.com. You can they have a study guide for it. So if you haven't seen the movie, and if you don't have access to it, I highly recommend you at least go to the website, check out that study guide. That reference guide is it's just a great 5-page document that has loads of information, even just high points of here's all the movies that we referenced in the film, here's all the people that we interviewed, and it just gives you a high level overview of some talking points, just some ideas to think about, like recurring tropes, recurring things in the documentary, but also just the entire history, really the 100-year history of natives in film. So all right, everybody, y'all have a good one. Hope you enjoy the interview. So I appreciate both of you coming on. We've been trying to organize this for a while, and I'm happy we could finally, get this coordinated, because both of you, well, one, you're Native, and two, you're twins, and three, you are actors as well. So I wanted to ask you all just to give yourself a quick introduction. Feel free to share whatever you want, but I wanted you to focus on those, at least highlight those three things. So I guess I'll go with who I see first in my Zoom. Kaylee, you want to go first?
Also makes sense because I'm 4 minutes older, so I usually go first at stuff. But
pure coincidence.
But yeah, Kara and I are fraternal twins. We're both enrolled members of the Wakamasuan tribe. We have always been interested in film and just in the entertainment industry, and just we both were theater majors in college. And I keep saying we both, and I want to give Kara a chance to say something, but but yeah, we both have enjoyed careers, done some film stuff, but mostly in the live theater industry. Not a lot of that happening these days with the coronavirus going on. But yeah, that's just a little bit about both of us.
Awesome. Kara?
Yes. Yeah. So I'm Kara. Really, I mean, everything Kaylee said applies to me as well. Definitely have.
So you both went to the same school for college?
We did.
Okay.
So a little bit of would you say competition there, Kaylee? Not really. We've never competed with each other.
No, but I think it was more like forced competition. We were never into being in a battle royale with each other. We definitely had some fights and stuff.
Oh yeah.
But yeah, no, I mean, by nature, acting and anything in the entertainment industry can be pretty competitive. So we were often up for the same roles and things like that, but we were really happy for the other one if they got it and we didn't.
I see. That's great. So I've only had one pair of friends that were twins. They were also fraternal, and they had a lot of heartburn and common things that they would gripe about, some of the common questions that they would get. What are some of before we jump into the film, I guess I was just curious, and you probably explore this in your podcast, Twindigenous. So I wanted to segue to talking about your show, but first, just with what are some common questions that you all get or have received or still to this day? One about just being Native in general, but being Native twins.
Yeah, we did actually cover this recently in a couple of episodes, and I remember Kara saying at one point, "Wow, we really got a double whammy," because we were always asked questions about being twins, if I punch her, can you feel it? well, are you gonna try me? um, and then like just dumb stuff and which, like I don't mean to call people dumb, but uh, we never experienced any kind of ESP type stuff. I don't think. I think we both are kind of intuitive by nature, but I don't think it was because we're twins.
I see.
Yeah.
Right. I think really more than anything, a lot of the questions we got were, who's the funny one? Who's
Oh.
the evil one? The this one, the that one? I think that kind of bothered me more than anything, just because it's like, well, we can both be funny.
Yeah.
We can both be, evil at times. Not really.
You
but...
can't just be two individuals. You have to be opposite ends, a yin and yang, Cain and Abel kind of situation. I see.
Right.
Well, let's get into this movie. I love how we crafted. We really bonded over this movie because we both have passion for Real Injun, directed by Neil Diamond, and I think your experience in theater and in film, I think it both kind of reveals some common frustrations, and this documentary brings to light a lot of how those misconceptions come about. When I first saw this movie, gosh, I can't remember when. It must have been shortly after college, so around like 2010, 11, somewhere around there. And I was blown away because of something that the director said in the trailer, which prompted me to go watch the movie immediately, which was basically he thought he was a lame Indian because he didn't ride horses, he didn't have a headdress, and I had the same complex growing up because I'm like, well, I'm Navajo, we don't have horses. I mean, we do have horses, but it's more like for rodeo and for rounding up cattle and stuff. It's never for like riding into war, and we don't have war bonnets as a culture, and we don't shoot bow and arrows, at least traditionally. And somebody's probably going to come out, actually, Ian, the Navajos and blah blah. But I mean, traditionally, it's not like a big piece of our culture, and so I just didn't. It goes back to that representation piece of like when I saw regular movies like native representation on television, I didn't see myself, and so I glommed onto what I did see that was quote unquote native, and I never made the connection that I was native too, that I was the native that he made, that they were talking about on screen, and I thought that was pretty awesome to see this documentary come to light. So, when did you all first see this?
Yeah, I remember first seeing it. It was a summer. It must have been either 2013 or 2014. And at the time, it was available to stream on Netflix. And I just remember thinking, like, there's a native movie on Netflix. That was kind of like when I first was getting introduced to the streaming on Netflix.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I remember my mind just being blown. Like, I can't believe this is available. And then eventually, I remember like Smoke Signals was on Netflix for a while. I don't know if I don't think it still is. But yeah, I just remember thinking like, this is so cool. And just, I probably watched it, I kid you not, like dozens of times. I've watched it, I think at least 3 times this year alone.
Wow. What about you, Kara?
Yeah, same. I'm thinking, Kaylee, did we watch it together initially? That's sort of what my memory is telling me.
I don't know.
But it would definitely be around the same time, same way through Netflix. I don't know if somebody recommended it to me, if I just kind of found it organically, but definitely initially watching it, I was blown away. I was like, this is really cool. This is what I've been looking for. A movie that explores that Hollywood image of the Indian and how it was crafted, how it is, become what most people in the world think it is today.
Right. Well, I kind of broke out the movie into just its major chapters. And so I think, just talking about each of those chapters, I think would be a good place to start. So I'll just give a quick summary of not a quick summary, but just like the outline of the chapters, and then we'll just start diving in. So the first part was Birth of the Hollywood Injun, which alludes to, really connects to what you just brought up, Kara, how it all started, and the noble Injun. And then we talk about the savage Injun, and then a good Injun is a dead Injun, and then the groovy Injun. And of course, within a good Injun is the dead Injun is the cowboy kind of stereotype and the cowboy reoccurring trope, cowboy versus Indians, that whole phenomenon. And but I wanted to start with just the opening comments, opening text, and then we'll jump off from there. The documentary opens with a screen that says, in over 4,000 films, Hollywood has shaped the image of Native Americans. Classic Westerns like They Died with Their Boots On created stereotypes. Later, blockbusters like Little Big Man, One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, and Dances with Wolves began to dispel them. Not until a renaissance in Native cinema did films like Once Were Warriors and Smoke Signals portray Native people as human beings. 100 years of cinema defining the Native American image to the world. Then it flashes to the next scene. Raised on cowboys and Indians, we cheered for the cowboys. We never realizing we were the Indians. Just like, wow, bars.
Yeah, that last part, it really hits home. I remember like kids like, let's play cowboys and Indians, and be like, oh God, please no. Just because like it just felt like, I will say, until Disney's Pocahontas, which I'm sure we might talk about, which is also super problematic. But until that movie came out, and I think we were Kara, maybe 6 at the time when that movie came out. But until that one, no one was, in my experience, ever rooting for the Indian. They were always the bad guy.
Right. And I think that, so I was 7, so we're about the same age when Pocahontas came out. Saw it 3 times in theaters. I have come from a tiny town of like 10,000 people. We have one theater that like spirals between being closed and shut down and opening. Somebody tries to keep giving it a chance. It's like a 2-screener. But I went and saw that in theaters 3 times. That was the first time I ever saw Native anything in a positive way, let alone being animated. And I was just like, wow, this is awesome. And of course, there were movies like Little Big Man that were out that were kind of, and Outlaw Josie Wells, that were kind of like revolutionary for its time. But I wasn't going to watch those as a 7-year-old.
Right. Exactly. Yeah, exactly.
And so for Pocahontas to see that, it's just like, oh my gosh. And you get posed those things. I don't know. I lived on the res. I don't ever remember being prompted to say, let's play cowboys and Indians, Ian. We just played like Power Rangers and stuff, like I don't remember.
Yeah. Oh, we definitely played Power Rangers too. Yeah. Kara and I didn't grow up on a res, and there were some Native people around us. And we definitely had some Native friends, but like the majority of people we were around, like outside of our dad and some family members mostly, and a few kids at school, the majority of people we were around were non-Native. And I remember once like standing in our house and a non-Native friend asking, do you guys live in a teepee? Like, we're literally in our house right now.
Yeah, I think maybe she thought we had one out back or something.
Oh, wow. You were in your house when you were asked that question?
Yeah. This is also this person I remember once for Christmas. It was very nice that her mom gave me a gift, but I do remember being gifted Pocahontas moccasins.
Oh gosh.
Yeah.
So were these like produced from the movie?
Yeah, oh my God, we had Pocahontas merch out the wazoo, just because it was so exciting to see this person as like, oh, it's a beautiful Native woman, and like you said, like it at the time it felt positive. Of course, now knowing the history more and seeing, how exactly Disney twisted that, we know better now. But oh my God, we had so much Pocahontas stuff at the time.
Sometimes it felt like at school the kids almost thought that we were Pocahontas.
Really?
Like it was like, did you get that feeling, Kaylee? Like I remember like being in I guess it was first grade, and it was like all of a sudden our image at school changed, and for just this fleeting moment there was something cool about us that people were interested in, because before we were just the shy Morrison sisters, but now like, I think I saw somebody who looks like you in a movie a little bit, something like that, I guess. But it's really weird. It's like a little switch flipped for a second and then flipped back off.
So did they know you were Native? Like, were you known, I guess, as like the Native, like students or the Native kids?
Yeah, we were, especially like in elementary school and kind of through high school. And I think Kara and I are both very, like, white passing now, but we weren't as kids. And that's kind of been interesting to navigate, going from one, version to another, not by will, but just by circumstance, I guess. But yeah, and there were some Native kids. So like, you knew all the, back then, Indian. Well, you knew all the Indian kids,
Yeah.
us being two of them. But I do have a specific memory of a girl on the school bus one day just looking at us and going, oh, you look just like Pocahontas. And like, because this was the 90s. This was like the era of the 90s supermodel, like Cindy Crawford and Heidi Klum and all these people. And so like to feel like you were included like in a beauty standard all of a sudden. But like Kara said, it did feel like it went as quickly as it came.
I see. Well, I think before we jump into the birth of the Hollywood Injun, I just want to say it felt so good to see John Trudell. I watched this 2 times before we have this interview, and I'm just like, it felt so good to see John Trudell again. R.I.P. John Trudell. What a great mind. What a prolific speaker. Everything he said, I'm just like, bars, bars.
Yeah.
and I have a quote from my website on my website directly from this. My whole show is really inspired by this documentary, because I was just like, why don't more people talk about this? And that's kind of a long-standing frustration that all three of us have, rather, that we acknowledge, is that not enough people see this, because it really lays out the problem in such a very concise way of how it's not just mascots, like it's not just policy, it's not just reservations, like they're all so intertwined. The representation of in media, in television, in film, it all bleeds into reality, and it bleeds into these interactions that you're talking about, of why it's okay to them anyway, to the non-native people, to ask you like, oh, she looks just like Pocahontas, or to have your friends stand in your fucking house and say, do you guys live in a teepee? And it's just like, geez, like where do you, and it's so hard to look back. Obviously the conceit of hindsight, you can look back and say, oh, that behavior is ridiculous, or how could you ever think that? But we were just kids asking kids another question, like a genuine question. If anything, that's the most innocent type of state that we're in. So those are like genuine thoughts, whether it's being fed to us by our parents, or people that are around us, or our reality that we're being fed through television and movies.
Yeah, and I think that's what really sticks out to me about this film. That's why I always, whenever anyone asks me, when they, now as an adult, and people ask me for clarification, or they want to understand the Native experience or perspective better, and of course it's not a monolith, but when they want to gain better understanding, the first thing I point to is Real Injun, because I think it really does such an amazing job of explaining the history of why does society, globally, not just America, not just the United States, but globally, people have an idea of what an Indian is. And very rarely is it based in history or accuracy or actual culture. I think dissecting how Hollywood did this is so important. And that's why I want everybody to watch this movie.
Completely agree. What about you, Kara?
Yeah, I've definitely, just like Kaylee said, I had to have like used this movie, or tried to, as a tool when friends who are not native and maybe don't understand my experience, or some sort of larger view of experience. And it's not a monolith, like Haley said. There's no perspective. But I think this film as a documentary is like, it's just a great tool. I wish that I could roll it into a room like how they did in the 90s at school, and have the DVD, or they like pop the thing in the VCR and they just play it for everyone. Like, that's what I just wish I could get everybody in a room and just push play and get everybody sitting down and watching it all together and experiencing it and feeling it. Because it's a really emotional documentary. Sometimes I watch it, I cry. Sometimes I get mad. It just depends. I have a different feeling every time I see it.
I think it's important too, because it's not the lens that we're like, when I see this now, I feel uplifted, but I'm with you, because when they try to have that, like the end of the movie, when they talk about this resurgence where Native people are telling their stories and they're telling their experience, you're like, yeah, but those are some shining examples. Overall, we haven't really made progress. But then there are other times I watch, I'm just like, fuck yeah, we're gonna take over. We're gonna tell our own stories. We're gonna take over. And so it's really, I completely agree with you. But I think one thing we can both agree on is that this kind of arc that it takes,
it tells a full story. And a lot of our frustrations with the, I think, modern and contemporary tellings of Native people, it's very much like in the vein of like poverty porn and telling just one side, where it's like we are oppressed, we are poor, we are living below the poverty line, and we are in dire kind of circumstances, and there really is a very bleak outlook moving forward. And I think that really helping to change that narrative is work, in progress, of course. But I really think that if you watch Real Engine, you're like, no, there is a resurgence. There is an attempt to try to take control of our narrative.
Absolutely. And I loved, there were lots of great interviews in this movie. Some I didn't understand, but like I definitely enjoyed all the Native interviews, and
For sure.
and seeing the passion, and seeing or being able to hear the perspective from like Native filmmakers and Native actors, and just seeing like a reclamation of it all.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it was great to watch the evolution. We kind of open up with this isn't in the opening, but later they get to like the Westerns, and I can remember trying to watch Westerns and being so afraid of them. They're so violent, so graphic.
Mm-hmm.
But then, as the documentary itself, you hear from like Russell Means, and you hear a little bit more about actual specific history. I just think it's great. It just covers such a great spectrum of filmmaking in such a short documentary. It's like over in a snap, really.
It's so crazy how, so we can kick it off with the birth of the Hollywood Engine, how from the inception of really the time when we had the ability to record, we weren't like, hey, I want to record a sunset. It was, hey, I'm going to go to Laguna Pueblo and record them dancing, which probably without their permission, and we had no conception of what they were doing. Now that's prohibited behavior. You don't do that. But it's interesting that Thomas Edison, when he unveiled a kinetoscope, that was like one of the first things that came to mind of like, ooh, these Indians, I want to capture them.
Yeah, I seem to also recall there being mention of like part of the reason why they wanted to capture natives on film, because like the thought was, oh, well, they'll be gone soon.
Mm-hmm.
I guess either because of, genocidal reasons or, assimilation, but that really stuck out to me.
You're absolutely right. And then it really the birth of the Hollywood Engine and the Noble Engine trope came about because of the idea that they were vanishing. I'm like, well, we need to memorialize these people as noble Indians. We need to memorialize them as these like spiritual beings. And so we need to capture their essence of who they really are, which is interesting that they wanted to accurately capture us in the 1930s and before. And then once they realized like, hey, we're not going to vanish, they're like, okay, we can do whatever we want now.
Yeah, it's so weird. It's so weird. I thought it was really cool to hear. And I have it saved in my queue, but I haven't watched it yet. But about The Silent Enemy, which was a movie made in the 30s. And they said it was a lot of Native people who actually like worked on the film, like who like helped to write it or create it. I'm forgetting exactly like what the credit was.
No, you're good. You're good. That's that was in the 1930s. The Silent Enemy was a black and white film, and that was really an accurate capture of the people as they were at that time, because it was the thought that these people are going to be extinct, very much like extinct birds and animals. They were just like, we need to capture their essence in case that this is the last that we see of them. So it was crazy. Kara, what did you think of those summer camps? They went from the Noble Engine talking about that to go to the summer camps. I had no idea those existed.
Yeah, well, okay, so I've seen Real Engine several times, but when I went back to watch it for the purpose of recording this podcast, I was like, I don't remember this in here, but it was, first of all, crazy. I've never seen something so blatant as far as just being completely, well, I've seen a lot of offensive things, but I mean, it's just very, very blatantly offensive. And so just to set it up, they're at this native themed summer camp, and they have the kids running around shirtless. They've got all this body paint on. They are part of tribes.
Mhm.
And it's just so weird to see this being taught to children. But the part that really stuck out to me watching it again recently was the scene where they're in their sort of like dining hall
Yep.
and they're banging their fists and acting completely barbaric, and watching Neil Diamond, the filmmaker
Sit
of Real
there.
Engine.
Yep. Sitting there watching them. Right.
Yes. And I thought to myself, like, he could have totally hulked out in that moment with rage.
Mhm.
And maybe that's just not a part of his makeup, but that would be upsetting for any Native person to sit through. It would make me feel sick to my stomach to be in the room with that. And I got to thinking, he really showed these people that he featured in this documentary a lot of grace.
I agree.
He did not shame them. He just sort of simply showed them the way that they were they were
Mhm.
behaving that way. And I think that's kind of ironic to think about the grace that he showed them, because Hollywood hasn't shown Native people that
Right.
much grace over the years. So yeah.
I agree. These summer camp scenes, and then I want your opinion, Kaylee. Really, I didn't know about these summer camps. I've seen instances of them in like film and television. So I talked about like Heavyweights. Like Heavyweights was set at the Ben Stiller movie, was set at a kind of an Indian summer camp, and then there's like Adam's Family Values
Mhm.
and Man of the House with Chevy Chase and JTT, Jonathan Taylor Thomas. So there's like those Indian kind of summer camp experience things that were out there that were represented in film, but I never saw the reality like this portrayed this way. And I thought it was just gross. One of the chants that they had, they were all saying, "Pass the peace pipe to Crazy Horse." And they just were like
Oh God.
banging their fists on the tables and clanging the plates and everything. And they were just like yelling that. And it was just this gross misrepresentation of it, but it stems from this noble Injun thing of like this is the idea that I want to hold on to. And it's almost because they captured him in this like vanishing Indian lens, like this in this encapsulation. They're like that. Those are the people that I want to see, not who they are now. I don't care what their culture looks like now. That's what I want to be.
Yeah, and these native themed camps must have been around for a while, because I recently rewatched the 1960s version of The Parent Trap with Haley Mills, and I realized, like, I
Oh,
forgot,
I never saw that one.
You're
I,
in the Arapaho cabin.
oh gosh, really?
Yeah, and they had like totem poles, and like, just, it wasn't like something that you saw a ton of, so that's why I think I missed it maybe as a kid when I saw it back then. But yeah, a few years ago, I was working on a play, and I was backstage, and I was playing a native character in the play, and I was talking to some folks backstage, and there was a guy, and just kind of similar to the like camp counselor in the film, very excited about all this, but the guy was like, "Oh yeah, I love all that stuff." And anytime anyone says like all
Hmm.
that, or you're all that stuff or whatever, red flag, red flag. But 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 yeah, and so he went on into detail about like all the feathers they would wear, and wearing headdresses, and
Jesus.
having tomahawks and all this stuff, and just speaking with such passion, completely oblivious
Right,
to
right.
just completely oblivious. And then I wanted to talk about I assume he was a camp counselor. He was an older guy, not old, but he seemed to be working for the camp as opposed to an actual camper, but he was just speaking with so much passion about,
Right. He was Austrian. Hmm.
yeah, Austrian, yeah, and he was just so excited to get to portray in his daily camp activities what he said he was from the Sioux tribe.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There was so much. Well, he graduated to that. He had his moment, his rite of passage, having been involved with that camp so much that he eventually got to that point where he was the Sioux leader. And there's there's an overall fascination. It's a completely different podcast episode to talk about it. There's an overall fascination just in Europe in general with the Indian. They have powwows all the time. They have this
Mm-hmm.
like they completely have this morphed culture, morphed idea of who we are, and they take it on and they kind of adopt it themselves, even though there aren't many natives out there at all. I mean, if they are out there, they've moved out there, of course.
Right.
Um, But anyway, jeez, that was
Yeah.
yeah. I
It's a
don't know.
lot.
I don't want to get sidetracked on that one. But
Well, I do want to say one thing that he,
Go
just
ahead.
before we move on, one thing that he said in the film was, he was like, I don't know much about the native people, but I did see 2 or 3 films back home. And so
Oh,
from that,
gosh.
I got the native mentality. I understood the native mentality. It's like, you got that from 2 or 3 movies? You can't get that from 2 or 3 movies. I don't care what the movies are. Like,
Mhm.
just crazy.
No, that's a great point, because there was no vetting. It was very much like, okay, I believe you. You want to be a Sioux leader at this kids camp? Sounds good, And he's like, what do you draw inspiration from? Saw 2 movies, and be like, that's great. That's 2 more than the rest of us. Let's get to it.
Mhm.
Gosh.
Yep.
But that like bastardization of who we are, and these like running with just a stereotype. It's almost. I had an interview with a brilliant guy, AC Agoya, who's the co-founder of Indians.com. He is a journalist, and he co-founded this website to really just fill the void of like accurate representation in just everyday media. And something that he said that was really profound was, non-natives come to natives when they come to you to be the representative, when they want you to like answer for everyone. They come to you to sanction their pre-existing beliefs or their existing behavior.
Yes.
And when I heard that, I'm just like, God, fucking bars. Like, I never articulated it that way, but that's exactly what it is. And I think that it's like they have that phenomenon of like, I don't have the answer I want from this native, so I'm going to go to another native. Or you get the answer you want from the native and you just never ask anybody else, because you're like, oh, I have that native friend who approved of my behavior and my beliefs.
Mhm.
And so that savage Indian, cut you off, sorry, but this like savage Indian idea, going into that with like red face, going into that with this next kind of era of film and television, where it's referred to, I guess, like the golden age of Hollywood. And this is kind of like you two's like, you really have a lot of passion around this age, where you would have just white people passing as native. They would put red face on, and they would really have anybody that spoke any native language and pass it off as authentic, or they would play English backwards and play it and pass it off as native. And so why I brought up this whole sanctioning behavior is, you ask any, you can ask one or a handful of other natives, and they might see it as problematic as red face, or some people, they're like, they see it as abhorrent behavior. But yeah, so it's kind of a divisive issue. But let's talk about that time in Hollywood, that savage Indian.
Yeah, and Kara and I, our whole lives, and I don't even really know what the origin is, but we've always just been really interested in kind of old Hollywood and classic films, and I'm talking like way back, and I love films
And
from
that's
every.
and that's kind of like the 20s to the 60s, right? Kind of that.
Yeah,
Okay.
definitely, and like, so I remember like growing up idolizing, like Carol Lombard and Rita Hayworth and all these, who were considered to be great beauties and stuff, and then you would watch a movie and you'd see Donna Reed in red face, and there's something so triggering to me about seeing a non-native woman dressed as a sexy Indian, and it's just, oh yeah. So while I love that era of film for other reasons, it's just so hard to get through sometimes. Just knowing that the like racist history of Hollywood, not just for natives, but just in general. So yeah, while I still love that era, it's getting harder because, one of my favorite, I'm a big Marilyn Monroe fan, and for a while I felt weird about saying it, but one of my favorite films of hers was, I think her only Western, which is called River of No Return, where she and Robert Mitchum, I think that's who it is. It's been a long time since I've seen it. They have to travel down this really treacherous river, and of course that's really dangerous. They almost die, and there's some really other problematic scenes that I realize now as I'm older. But yeah, they get attacked by natives, and it's so hard because I loved her, and otherwise, like, the movie was great, but you just see these red-faced, I'm assuming white actors, just being completely barbaric, trying to kill them, and it just, it's so triggering for me.
Right.
Yeah. I don't have a lot of specific like specific memories of seeing people in red face. I mean, I definitely have seen it in my lifetime, but usually with red face, in a lot of the old Westerns and whatnot, they were really violent movies. And so as a kid, I was terrified of them. And so I would just like turn it off. I couldn't watch it. It just really disturbed me. Like I don't know. It was just weird.
No,
Weird
I get it. Care, I want your thoughts on this. When this time in the documentary, when this red face era that was in line when really at the dawn of this savage Injun trope, the savage Indian, and really that influenced the native mascots and the portrayal of like that kind of caricature kind of image that represents schools and professional sports, elementary all the way to professional sports. But it was always, we were in the way. And so they needed to villainize these people because we were in the way of, westward, moving westward. So what did you think of that at that time period?
Yeah, I liked the piece of the focus that they gave to John Wayne in the documentary, and that's the only time I like to have focus on John Wayne. I'm not a fan, but they explained in Real Injun about how the real American were these sort of pioneers, these Western frontiersmen who were just trailblazing out west and settling homes and, for their families.
That was really the dawn of the cowboy, right? The protector of modern America who conquered the West and protected us from the Indian, right?
Right. And it just, of course, in that narrative, anybody else who wants something different, who has a claim to their homeland, who, doesn't want to relocate or whatever, in any given plot is, of course, they're going to be in the way. They're going to be the bad guy. They're going to be evil characters. And that feeling of being afraid of that, watching that as a kid, has really stayed with me to this day. I don't ever watch Westerns, really. They're not my thing. There's even like the modern version of the Western I can't really take in, even if I just assume there's going to be a bad native in it, which maybe is my, misconception, but I just can't do it. I can't watch them.
What about you, Kaylee? Can you watch them?
No, I can't. And
No,
and I feel like most times when I've seen these really harsh, and that's putting it mildly, representations of Hollywood's idea of natives, it's been by accident. Like I remember once watching Little House on the Prairie, and it was like it felt like a movie. I don't know if it was like a special or something, but it was definitely Little House on the Prairie.
TV show, right?
Yeah, the TV show from the 70s. And of course they're pioneers and all this. And Michael Landon, who was Pa, whatever his name was, I just know he was the dad.
Right.
He had to leave to go handle some business, so it was just like the little girls and the mom. And at some point, these two Native men came in, and like you thought, like, oh my God, what are they going to do? Are they going to violate these women and girls? And just they had this really tense standoff, and like it was just very clear that they were there to only do harm. And I had no idea that was in the program, and that was I felt kind of ambushed by that.
I'm glad you brought that up, because the modern Western, you really have to dig to find instances where it's encouraging. So an example of that would be like Last of the Mohicans, when the core group, the three, Daniel Day-Lewis and Eric Schwig, they kind of go to their settler friends at the beginning of the movie in the middle of the night. And there was a reimagining of that trope that you're talking about. When Indians come knocking, it's always meant death, especially when the man wasn't around, when the guy with the gun wasn't around. It meant there was going to be rape. It meant there was going to be murder or kidnapping. So it's good to see kind of changing that narrative in some sense, in some ways. But it then leads to this next scene it works so beautifully in this documentary, because they paint this picture of like the savage Injun, and then it goes to the only good Indian is a dead Indian. And And then it goes to Looney Tunes of all things. The Bugs Bunny, when he's defending the fort, and he's
Yeah.
singing the 1 little, 2 little, 3 little Indians. And then he was like, oh, actually, that's 3.5. That one was a half breed, and I'm just
Right.
like, geez. And I think Neil, I want your thoughts on this, is Neil Diamond gives a voiceover during this kind of Looney Tunes scene. And he's saying, as a kid, I didn't realize it was me that Bugs Bunny was killing. I thought there was so much truth to that. And I was the same way. I disconnected myself from all of that. I didn't realize.
Yeah, it's weird. I don't know. I have no memory of like when I became aware of being Indian.
Mm-hmm.
Like obviously like I felt like I wasn't Black, I wasn't white. And just like for full disclosure, my my dad is Native and my mom is white. But I was a brown person at the time. I'm not brown anymore. And so I knew like, well, I'm not either of those things. And then I remember kids at school talking about it and then asking my dad questions about it. But I don't know like when I became aware. But one moment that does stick out to me is I feel like a lot of stuff happened in first grade. Like, that was like shit's getting real. But I remember there was like a Native dance group that came to perform for our school. And I remember the kid next to me making fun of it the entire time. And that was the first time I really felt embarrassed and thinking like, oh God, they think that these dancers are weird. Everyone's going to think that I'm weird. And I remember and I hate that so much of my childhood and even on into like adolescence and early adulthood, I feel like so much of my nativeness was just wrapped up in embarrassment and shame because I just felt like the people around me, thought poorly of natives.
Yeah, I have I don't have the same memory of the dance group that you mentioned, Kaylee. And I don't have a total awareness of when things started to click for me. But I do remember, sitting around with my dad and we'd watch like old Western TV shows or whatnot. And I feel like I must have had these moments of like, that's not us. Like these people on the screen, that's some other kind of Indian. Like we're not that. That must be some sort of something else. I just don't even know. Which of course they lumped all Native people together into this giant melting pot of stereotypes or pieces of, various cultures just to be more identifiable on screen. But yeah, I didn't have this awareness that, oh, okay, they're talking about me. They're talking about people who look like my dad. That was never a thing. Yeah, so it's just, yeah.
Well, there's a certain age group too that you view this as like, this is their Pocahontas in a way. Like I say that meaning like that when they were coming of age, when they were growing up, and what was hype was John Wayne movies, The Searchers, really those were box office hits. When I talked with Charlene Teeters, who is a famous advocate for changing the name, changing the mascot, she even grew up loving like F Troop. It's a TV show from back in the day, and it's everyone's in red face, and it's a complete all the negative stereotypes you can think of natives are in that, but it's comedy and people love it. And natives grew up loving that show, and natives grow up still, or actually older natives still love some of these Westerns. And it's so hard to separate that for some people, and yeah, it's such an odd phenomenon. What I did enjoy is they talked about pretendians in this. They talked about one of the most famous pretendians, Iron Eyes Cody. And this was good education for me because before I saw this documentary, I had no idea. I mean, I never even heard of the commercial, honestly, because that was before my time. But I went down a rabbit hole of internet searches after I saw this. What did you all know about Iron Eyes Cody before? I mean, who he was and the controversy before this doc?
Mainly remember becoming aware because it was the famous PSA with the one tear rolling down his face was before our time too. But I always remember it being referenced. Like I think like The Simpsons parodied it once, and it was always like referenced in pop culture.
Yep.
And then
I never knew where that came from. Dave Chappelle has a stand-up bit about it, and I was like, "Where is that coming from?" So.
Yeah, I think I've seen that. But yeah, so I was always aware of it like in this kind of like as a reference. And then I remember at some point seeing the actual commercial and hearing like, well, he wasn't really an Indian. And then the film really goes into his history a bit more. And yeah, he was Sicilian, Italian.
He was Sicilian, right?
Yeah, and how it's kind of like you hear all these you hear this term transracialism and like is all that stuff today, and like Rachel Dolezal and
right.
Hilaria Baldwin and more recently Michelle Latimer and
even Elizabeth Warren, right?
Elizabeth Warren, thank you, yes. But yeah, it's I think it's actually way more common than most people realize, and I actually think it's going to become even more common the more that BIPOC Black, Indigenous, people of color voices, the more that they're amplified, the more that like people who have never had to wait their turn, I think they're going to be grabbing for like, okay, well, what part of my heritage can I reach for? So to make myself feel relevant or to make myself feel important or to give myself opportunity. And yeah, I was curious about y'all's thoughts on how the documentary approached Iron Eyes Cody, because I almost felt like it was, I mean, like we established, Neil Diamond is just very respectful and gives a lot of grace all throughout and just kind of like shows things as opposed to like giving opinion. But it felt kind of soft to me. But I don't know if like I'm just being like, because I just pretending to really frustrate me.
No, I get it. Kara, what do you think?
Yeah, I definitely got the sense. I was like, he's going a little easy on them. And, maybe I'm just totally speculating here because he featured, his son. Maybe he kind of did that out of kindness to him so as not to.
And his son is Native because he did marry, I think it was a Navajo, what it looked like based on the res.
Right. And so maybe he did that out of attempt to kind of bridge a gap, like, hey, just so you know, I'm not trying to exploit your dad. I'm not trying to call your dad out. That's just totally me speculating. But yeah, he did definitely go easy on him. And there's nothing so wrong with having some sort of affection for a culture that is not your own. To fully adopt it is a little strange.
Yeah. To adopt it and not even look into it in the sense that and have no reverence for it, just be like, okay, there's a part of me that's that, and I have an interpretation of what that means, and so I'm going to run with it. Is that what you're kind of saying, Kara?
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. So I when it comes to the percentages and the fractions of a fraction, like I'm frankly okay with people telling me that, when they come up and they identify with, I mean, it's weird that they identify to me with that, or like, hey, Ian, I'm so-and-so % Native, but to just take that at face value and say I am entitled to something, or to have this like misconception that Natives are reaping some kind of benefit from being a part of this group and being part of this club. Really, that's what they kind of view it as, is like, hey, I have membership now to this club. What do you all think of that? Do you get kind of those misconceptions of like, what you get, whether it's money or, no taxes kind of stuff?
Yeah, I think I do often hear like, well, what do I get? What will benefit me financially, or what will benefit me like in resources or something, and which is really crazy to me. but I think the main objective I tend to see, well, there's really kind of two. And one is very general in that like people have this fantasy of what a Native means, and like, oh, I have a magicness inside of me because I'm part Native, or there's this mystical thing about me, and I understand nature, or whatever the fantasy is for them. And that's more of a general example, but more specifically to that, what I've seen in my experience as an actor, as someone who works in theater and film, is I see people using it to get ahead in that way, and to get opportunities in that way, and to get roles and to get grants and funding or opportunities, and that's always really disturbing to me and harmful.
I'm glad you bring that up. So I want to talk about this real quick and then go on something you touched on, which is I don't know what it is, like fascination of like Native beauty both in males
Mhm.
and both in men and women. And I really am curious about you two's thoughts, because that to me is like, some days I'm just like, what the fuck is going on? Other days I'm like, this is gross. But I do want to finish up on Iron Eyes Cody, because he is one of those individuals who took roles, or took an opportunity from a Native person by posing as a Native. But I think more important, had no connection or understanding of what the culture was, and just gave this almost representation of how he interpreted it. And I think that's the most problematic, is he was the face of the franchise. He was the face of all Natives for a long time, and was the reference for a lot of people.
Right.
And the stereotype aside, if you throw up his trash on the floor, we cry. It's like, yeah, everyone's capable of that. But I think it was just this, that we are the first environmentalist, and I think that's popular now, as people saying like, oh, Natives were the first environmentalists, and it's just like, ugh, yikes, we didn't waste anything, we never
Yeah.
wasted anything in the buffalo. Well, it's just like, you don't need to romanticize it like that. If you have no refrigerator, of course you're going to use everything. You have to.
Right.
What else
It
are you
was
going to
a
do?
lot of like, it was mostly like practicality. Like, of course, I'm
Mhm.
not going to abuse the land in a way that's going to make me sick or kill me. It's just a
Right.
lot of it's just common sense, and some of it is more passionate stewardship. But to put on a label of the first environmentalists, I wouldn't throw that on. But yeah.
So, I want to really talk about John Trudell's quote on that. But I want to go to Kara and talk about, and I want to tee it up for you. So in my research, and every time I look at a movie, especially where there's Michael Grey Eyes is a perfect example. Martin Sensmeyer is another good example. Kiowa Gordon is another good example. They're not just handsome. They're like almost like the words that they use in the YouTube comments, like from everybody. It's like they have this like, almost like we're glowing, like we're vampires from the Twilight. Like there's this like mysticism in a way. Like can you explain that to me? Like do you agree, and what do you think of that? Same with female, both men and women.
Oh boy. Gosh, I don't know. I'm struggling to come up with an explanation for that. I think people have to place a weird fetish on everything, and I'm not fetish shaming, but to do it on a specific culture or
That's almost what it is, right? Like fetishizing
yeah,
Native people, like our features.
yes, specifically fetishize. Ooh, that's a hard word to say. Putting a fetish on certain groups of people, it's really bizarre. Uh, I'm sorry, I'm struggling to come up with an answer for that, because
Well,
it's boggled me.
if I may add, there's just such a long history. Like, I was listening to a podcast a few weeks ago to do some research, and they were like talking about how Englishmen like wrote in their journals and stuff when they first came to the shores of what we know now as like Virginia, and they wrote about seeing Native women and how these were the most beautiful women they've ever seen. Like, but
Mm,
they also haven't seen women in a year, so of course, I mean, I'm sure they probably were beautiful, but they were Native after all. But
that's a great point.
yeah, but they, you know, uh, it just has such a long history of just, yeah, dehumanizing, and like, I own a piece of this, or this is appealing to me even though I know nothing about it, or I'm lumping a group together. Yeah, it just has a really long history.
Well,
Yeah.
and that, go ahead, Kara.
Oh, sorry.
No, no, no.
It just came to me. It's that people want to like glom on to this idea of, ooh, this is spicy, this is exotic, this is different from
Mm.
me, this isn't my normal go-to. It's that idea of exoticism and just having
Novelty.
novelty.
Speaking of
Yeah.
novelty, those like trashy covers of like books where they always have like really super jacked Native guy with like the white woman like clutching onto him. Like it stems in that too. And I've never dived into any of that, but I'm sure a lot of those stereotypes are perpetuated in those.
Absolutely, yeah. And actually, Kara and I, we dove a little bit into this in our most recent episode of our podcast. But yeah, it's so weird how it's lasted so long and it still is so popular. Like you can go on Google right now. I'm not telling anyone to do this, but you can find like sexy native, or a lot of times they'll call it Indian costumes, and they'll have these crazy names. Like we were reading some off recently, and one was like Making Reservations, or
Oh
Prances with
gosh.
Wolves, or sexy, and of course Pocahontas and all this crazy.
Mhm.
Ugh.
It's so gross that it continues, but I think it hits home when you have issues that plague in Indian country like MMIW.
Mhm.
This missing murdered indigenous women, I think of is partly perpetuated by this notion in film that native women are less than, because they're one, if they're ever in films, they're silent and they're to be taken, and they're not to be on the same level as other women in film. Can you guys address that a little bit? That's not really talked about in this documentary, but what are your thoughts on that? Do you agree?
Yeah, that is something that actually stuck out to me with this recent rewatch, is that I was like, wow, I wish they would have focused on Native women a little bit more. We kind of
Mm-hmm.
get like a flash of it. Um, but I think the core of the issue is that Native people and Native women are just at a very basic level dehumanized. There's no depth to the characters. There's
Mm-hmm.
no complexity to their makeup. It's just like they have one emotion. Maybe it's that they're stoic. Maybe it's that they are grieving, whatever it is. But their stories are not fleshed out. They're not fleshed out as people. So, of course, when that is shaping how we see them as a culture, as a group, as a person, we're not going to see them as human, because that's not how they're presented to us on a mass level.
Kaylee, what about you?
Um, yeah, well, I agree with all of that. But also too, because so many people aren't even at all familiar with MMIW, or any other like missing girls, or males too.
Right.
And
It really is an invisible statistic. And there are a lot of grassroots efforts, for those of you that don't know, that are listening, to try to shed awareness so that we can get some legislation in place to direct resources to solve these. One, find the people who are missing, try to track down those cases so we get some resolutions to the families and get these people home, but also to stop it from reoccurring in the future, put in measures in place so this doesn't continue to be a recurring issue. And it has been really ever since the inception of reservations. But go ahead, Kaylee.
right, and I was just gonna say that it seems, I get the impression that when I do make people aware of this issue, that they seem to naturally assume that the majority of perpetrators in these cases are also native, and that this is
Mm,
something happening on
that's a good
reservations, like
point.
domestically. And of course, like there are cases of domestic issues, just as there are in any other culture or racial group. But statistically, and I don't have the number in front of me, but statistically, it's mostly non-native perpetrators, and a lot of them
Mm,
don't face justice, and a lot of the cases don't get the type of coverage that they deserve. And yeah, I think it's like this idea of like, it's colonialism in practice, and it's this idea of being able to possess native people.
I think what's frustrating too is there's been attempts to raise awareness in movies like Wind River, the prime example, but it paints just a bleak outlook of, look at these poor natives, and unfortunately there's no hope in sight, and the movie ends of just like, oh gosh, this is going to be a recurring issue. And I want to see more positive representation in that. And I think it's really, I think that falls on us. I think as Native people, like with that where it falls on our shoulders, and that we need to be the ones to shoulder that load and try to tell our own stories. Because if non-Native people try to understand it, it's really just, oh, that's sad. Oh, that's terrible. And I
Hmm.
hate to see that. I see you nodding your head, Carrie. Do you agree?
Yeah. Anything regarding Native people, Native culture, Native like works of pop culture, everything falls on our shoulders if it's like a legitimate cause that we are all trying to shed light to, or what have you. When it's the hard stuff, it's like, oh, that's all on you guys. You guys gotta tell
that's a
that
great
story.
observation. Mm-hmm.
Right. But when it's, rainbows and the mystic Indian, it's like, well, we want a piece of that. We want to help you tell that story.
That is a great point. When it's fashion, they're like, "Oh, everyone has access. This isn't cultural appropriation. This is just a feather. It's all of a sudden not part of us." I completely agree. What do you have?
Right.
I see a nod in your head too, Kaylee.
Yeah, no, I agree with all of that. And yeah, it's reminding me of the part in the film about the groovy Indian and like hippie culture.
Yeah, you are taking this right in line with the chronology of the film, and the last section, really, before they talk about this reimagining of where we go in film, this kind of uplifting message, is the groovy Indian, where we went from the only good Indian is a dead Indian to all of a sudden everybody wanted to be Indian. And I love this scene because, or this section of the movie rather, because the Westerns are going out of style at this time. And so now everybody wants to be Indian. It's Woodstock, it's Vietnam, people are environmentalists, and we start being referred to as the first environmentalist. But I think one of the single greatest things I've ever heard a human being say came from John Trudell, and I will quote it right here. They were in a way trying to imitate us, but in another way, they were trying to remember who they were. Every human being is a descendant of a tribe. So these white people, they're the descendants of tribes. There was a time in their ancestry when they wore feathers, all right? And they wore beads and shells. There was a time in their ancestry before this colonizing mentality came and did to them what came and turned them into the white people that they are then came and did it to us. That very same thing that happened to us happened to them. And when I heard that, I was just like, how do you have those thoughts? Like that is such a great understanding of what really happens. And it's such a great, concise way to explain the whole situation. And it's so gross that it plays out that way, that we lose sight of our self eventually. And so you glom onto people that you associate are closer to themselves. And you're like, I want that. I want to capture a piece of what I used to be.
Yeah, and I think kind of going a little bit back to the pretending thing, it's when I hear these people who are always, well, my great-great-grandmother was a full-blooded Cherokee princess.
Mm-hmm.
What I really hear in that is a desire for something that they feel is missing, that and something that they feel like they need from their history. And so many people, through whatever circumstance, don't know their history or don't know their ancestry or don't know, further back pre the history that we have written down. And I just feel like there's a desperateness to, like, let me cling on to something that feels tangible. And for a lot of people, it's their idea of nativeness.
Yeah. I think humans at their base level really crave that sense of belonging. And of course, the idea in the 60s of like the brotherhood of the Native people, of course, that's going to be enticing for them. It's like they want in on this exclusive club. And, like with the Pretendians, those who really buy into any kind of family folklore that rings as like a red flag to us, my great-great-grandmother was this or that. We know that's a red flag sometimes when people say that, but they're really, they're searching for that sense of belonging. They're trying to find that way to relate to you when they're talking to you as a Native person. I can't help but get a little annoyed. It's like, we could talk about how both of our favorite color is orange. There is that,
right? Gosh. I seldom forget that that's even a possibility, just because that's never happens. It's always like, oh, you're Native. Let's talk about that. And I'm just like, hey, I got other things I'm interested in. I have a television in my house. We can talk about TV. Instead, they want to talk about, like, oh, what's it like growing up on a reservation? Do you have casino money? Blah, 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 blah. These super personal questions that they just feel obligated to ask because they're like, finally, I met one of you.
Yeah.
Right.
I think the phenomenon that you're talking about, Kara, is explored in Sebastian Junger's book, Tribe, when it's talking about how we have this innate quality in ourselves that thirsts to be a part of a small community, that thirsts to be a part of the tribe. And it's representative in these historical stories of where you have natives who kidnapped, quote unquote, but you have people who came from a settler community that eventually found themselves either adopted or taken, and then found themselves not wanting to go back to their original communities because they're like, man, this is life. This is what living is. The crap that we're doing over there isn't. And I think that it speaks to a lot of that, like being connected closer to really just a group of people and not being in this like capitalistic environment where it's like, and worrying about, keeping up with the Joneses and this kind of rat race that we all seem to find ourselves in. And I think there's a fascination to try to connect with disconnecting from the land and having these tiny homes and, you know, all this, that, and the other, retiring as early as possible. And I think a part of that is saying that you're native so you can feel closer to that. It's kind of a stretch, but I think there's a certain piece of that.
Makes sense.
What bothers me is 2 to 3%, a 16th, my great-great-grandma. You have so much other of you that is something else, and you want to take that small piece and be like, that's what I want to be, you know?
Yeah. And the thing I try to educate people on, and I really do try to do it as kindly as I can, because I do realize that it's not coming from a place of malice. Normally it can cause harm, but it's usually not malintended. But I just try to explain that. I also don't enjoy being or feeling like I'm a gatekeeper in any way either. That's very unpleasant. But I just do try to explain the difference between an ancestry or heritage versus a lived experience.
Right.
Because the two things are just very different. And it's very complicated. And I don't pretend that it's not a complicated issue, because it's very complicated. But the stakes are different. Yeah, I don't know. It's hard. And I've been giving a lot of thought lately.
It's very difficult, and I tried to talk about it in a few episodes ago when I talked about pretendians, of like the native experience is like it's exemplified in COVID-19, because traditionally your community is, you may have been removed somehow or left the reservation as a family or never been on there as a family, but your community still is in some way a community somewhere, and they are going to be in a lower SCS category, and they do have a smaller number of a diminishing level of native speakers that has been plagued by this pandemic. And because we carry comorbidities at a higher rate than the rest of the nation, we're affected at a higher level than other places. And so when you're a part of these communities, like, you're affected in a different way than everybody else, simply by virtue of who you are and who you come from. And I feel like these pretendians that kind of have that situation where they're just like, well, you know, my great grandma was this, and I kind of hold on to that. It's like, I don't know. It's so hard to not want to. It's so hard to say, like, I'm not being a gatekeeper, when some people hear that and you're like, well, I feel like you're talking about me. And I'm just like, you know, I'm really trying to come as honest as possible when I say, like, I'm not trying to direct this at one specific person. Like, I'm trying to talk about me coming to terms with this crap, because it's just like for natives, it gives us a complex of like, and it causes infighting, and that's even worse than the pretendians in my opinion.
Absolutely. Yeah. It's so complicated, and it's so tough. And I think, fortunately and unfortunately, it requires a lot of self reflection and self-education. And I think it's hard because we as natives, you know, who are very passionate about certain things, we want to step up and be the educator, but it gets exhausting.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I actually read a great quote today, and I don't know who said it, but a friend of mine sent me an article about the whole Michelle Latimer thing. And, you know, there was a thing in the article that was great, where it kind of explains why Native people, at least in the entertainment industry, if not all industries and walks of life, why we get so defensive when we do encounter a pretendian. And it's because the thing is that when you get to skip over the quote, like, trauma of being Native, not to say that all Native perspectives and experiences are based on trauma, but when you get to skip over all of that stuff, you get further in your career, because you're just focused on doing you. You're just focused on getting that next gig, getting that next thing. You're not working through all the hurdles of discrimination and, you know, getting past, you know, whatever it is that you might feel is holding you back.
I think a lot of times too is because of the communities we come from overall, you're never just self-serving in your endeavors. Like you're trying to, you have your community always in mind. Maybe it's not your community, your family, because you're like, well, if I make it, then my family makes it, you know, and it's not just you. So your career trajectory changes by virtue of being Native. You're like, well, I can't spend 6 months out of the year on the road. You know, I'm going to be so far away from my res. I can't do that. But you have a pretendian that's like, yeah, I'll play Indian. Let's do it. You know, I'll go to, you know, wherever you're shooting this movie. And that's a very specific perspective. You know, that's not everybody, but I certainly think there's a large number of people that fall into that category. I think that the great thing about this film is it has some great companion documents, and I think I'll post a blog on the website and have it attached, when really it talks about how it influences things like Land O'Lakes, you know, butter, and it influences like the mascots in, it doesn't directly reference it in this movie, but there's a direct parallel between how representation in film and television makes it acceptable to have the Atlanta Braves and the Washington Redskins and the Kansas City Chiefs. And it's it's pretty cool to see now, to tie it in line with the movie, how some of that is changing and how some of that is being overturned. You all are in North Carolina, so like I'm sure there are a lot of Atlanta Braves fans in your area, right? Or what baseball teams or native sports teams are like prominent in your area?
I know nothing about sports, so I tune most sports conversations out. I do hear stuff about the Braves, and then of course like there's, you know, you'll see like high schools or elementary schools that'll have like a Native mascot or something. I don't see much of those nowadays, but like every once in a while I'll encounter like someone wearing a t-shirt, or I'll just go over someone's house and they have a Redskins sticker on the refrigerator or something. And so yeah, I mean,
did you ever see yourself in that, like when you saw that, or was that something just so different from how you saw yourself? Like, did you recognize very much like the Bugs Bunny thing?
Yeah, that felt weird because like those things don't feel alive. Like they're not personified. It feels like, I still think they're wrong and offensive, but like they felt different in that we don't ever hear that little redskin, and forgive me for using that word.
No, it's
I
fine.
know that's a really triggering word for some people. We don't see that logo talking. At least I don't. There's probably like versions of it, but I've never seen, you know, a voice given to it.
So you know, I will clarify the Redskins thing. I will 100% say it. And when people tell me that's an offensive word, it's just like, well, for 32 years of my life, it was perfectly acceptable. Right. So and I've heard it, and I've been told to my face, Ian, it's not offensive. How do you think that's a problem? And I'm like, if people want to come at me and say, you shouldn't say it's the R word now, I'm just like, hey, maybe when I'm old and gray, it'll be the R word. But it's the you know, the scars, the wounds are still fresh to me.
And there's a thing too, like when it's like, sometimes I'll refer to myself as Indian, especially if I'm talking about like myself as a kid, because that's the only like Native and Native American and were kind of newish terms at the time, and it's all about I think your personal relationship to the word. And
100%.
it might be triggering to someone else, but it's just we're all living and learning. I guess
that's yeah. I mean, we're all on our own process, on our own path. I throughout my lifetime, I've been American Indian, Native American, Navajo, Diné, Indigenous. For a while there, I just avoided it altogether, you know. So we're all on this journey. We all find it, you know, and there is no right answer. And what I thought was interesting is when I think about the Redskins term, it used to be embraced in Native communities. My dad is a child of the 80s. Back in the day, they used to call each other skins, you know. They're like, oh, did you see any skins over there? He always said that to me anytime I went somewhere that wasn't on the res. You know, I would go somewhere and be, oh, did you see any skins there? And just like, I knew he knew what he was talking about. So we just kind of like reimagined that term.
Yeah, I definitely think there's a generational divide, not just on that, but on several things. And like we were saying, like it goes back to pop culture and films too. Like there's an interesting generational divide between older generations saying to embrace because that's what they had, and
I agree.
Yeah.
What about you, Kara? Do you ever see any of that growing up? Or are you the same? Not a sports fan?
I'm not a sports fan. I do have a specific memory that happened maybe like 6 or 7 years ago. But I was living and working in Cherokee, North Carolina. And for folks that don't know, that's the homeland of the Eastern Band of Cherokee.
Okay.
And a guy that I knew who was white, he was working there for a time. And I don't know if he was a fan of the Redskins. I'm not sure what his thing was, but he was going around at work one day and asking all the Native folks, like, how do you feel about it? How do you feel about it? How do you feel about
I got
it?
that a lot too,
And
right?
I could tell he was like looking for that. Yeah, it's okay. We don't care. And a lot of people did give him that, or at least a handful of them did. But it just really bugged me. I was just like, you can't let this one, afternoon where you're going around polling people speak for everyone. Like that's not how it works. And it really bothered me. I was like, why are you doing this?
To take it back to the film, no, I completely agree, because it goes back to what I was saying about AC's comment of like they look for individuals to sanction their beliefs and sanction their behavior, and then they run with it. And they're like, well, I got validation, it's okay for me to say it, which is unfortunate. And that's why we need movies like, we need this resurgence to start telling the real story, so people are like, oh, these aren't caricatures, these are real people that still have real stories to tell and real experiences that are different from my own. So in the film, we kind of are at the very end of it where they're showing, films like The Atre Nageotte, The Fast Runner, and Smoke Signals, and Once We're Warriors, where this resurgence of like, hey, we're reclaiming our stories, we're reclaiming our ability to tell our own narrative, to frame our narrative in representation. Were there any like movies that you saw that were like, I wish this was included in that? Or that or that now that is like a favorite afterwards that you're like, oh, I wish, we talked more about this movie?
For me, again, seeing it again fresh for the purpose of the podcast, I really noticed, I was like, I have become an extremely casual viewer, as far as like, I don't go and seek out a lot of specific stories. I just kind of like, oh, this is what's hot this week, I'll put that on Netflix or whatever. And seeing it again and watching them talk about The Fast Runner, which I've never seen, it's made me realize I'm like, I need to like go out with purpose. I haven't been doing that. I've gotten really lazy about the way that I take in films or take in television. So it's definitely made me think like I need to get back on my game and not be this hypocrite. I'm telling people go seek out Native stories, yet I've gotten super lazy about it myself. I need to get back into doing that.
I appreciate that vulnerability, and it's evident in all of us when we all say like, oh yeah, I need to go and learn my language. I'm real passionate about it, and I need to go find Native stories. But it's so hard because it has to be deliberate, unfortunately. Would you agree, Kaylee?
Yeah, I do agree. It's until like do y'all find that sometimes it's, maybe I'm wrong for saying this, but it's just a thought. Do you ever find that it's hard at times to watch certain Native films because like there's like this like pressure, like I hope I really love it, or I hope it feels really good to watch, or I hope I connect with it. Yeah, I don't know. I find myself, I don't know if y'all are Amazon Prime users, but I thought it was really cool that this past November for Native Heritage Month, they had like a special section of Native made films, which
That's
I thought
awesome.
was really cool. Yeah.
That was right when I started the podcast. I missed my chance to talk about that, and next year I will. But I agree. It's great that they do that. And I think that, much like February right now on Netflix and in Prime, they're highlighting kind of these Black stories, and it's great for them to do that. And I hope they continue to do that in February, November, but just in general, because we're pushing out content all the time, but it's incremental. The progress has to start somewhere. I kind of forgot your question, Kaylee.
Oh, do you feel like it's sometimes hard to consume Native content because there's almost like this pressure, not pressure, but your hopes are hung on it.
Your hopes are hung on it, but also it's like you almost feel obligated to like it because there's so few content, and it's like you don't want to be a hater, especially when some people are like really proud of it. And like, look at this great movie, and it was like that with Hostels when Hostels came out. I don't know if you've seen that with Christian Bale and Wes Studi and Adam Beach and Rosamund Pike. Some people heralded that as a great movie. I thought it was the most boring thing I've seen in 2020. And I'm just like, it pains me to have to rewatch this for an episode, but it's like, it's so hard because there's such a variety in taste, and we're just regular people. I mean, at the end of it all, we're just regular people, and we want to see ourselves representative, not just like our stories, but also in the taste that we like, in the genre that we want to see, whether that's horror or drama or comedy.
I'm not sure how related this is, but I love Smoke Signals. Great movie. But I do have to kind of poke fun at a couple of things in it, like the Adam Beach's wig in that movie just kills me. I'm just like, you couldn't have got him a better wig for this. Like,
that's a wig. I've never had long hair, so I could never tell.
Not the long
hair when he cuts it.
When he cuts his hair, his wig sits really far down on his forehead, completely giving away the fact that it is a wig.
Interesting.
And it's
the most wiggy wig.
I find it very distracting. But other than that, I have just complete affection for the movie. And I feel guilty when I just zero in on that one flaw. But it's there.
It's fine. It's really a testament to the pressure that Kaylee talks about of like having to like it. Like, why you don't like Smoke Signals? What's wrong with you? It's just like, hey man, I don't like movies like that. I don't like maybe road trip movies. That's not for me. Or just like, I want to see a horror movie instead. I don't like these happy-go-lucky films. It's okay to have a certain taste. And I think a part of us too, it's like want to be punk rock and be like, there was a time in my life when I hated Smoke Signals because I went through that. I hated the movie. As I became an adult, though, I kind of saw the humor connected. It started to land more and it made more sense.
Yeah, I'm really grateful for that film in particular, just for the character of Thomas, in that I relate to him so much. And it's so nice to see kind of a gentle, maybe even nerdy native depiction. And that, you have Victor, Adam Beach's character, who's like, you got to be tough. You got to be like a warrior. And and he really looks like you could push him over with a daisy or something. I know,
right.
And I've always felt like that really resonates with me. Like, I'm not a very tough person. I'm a very sensitive person, and so I love that will forever be an important film for me. Just because of that character.
It's still a GOAT. I mean, no matter the fact that it's been, 20 some years, it's still like something we hold up on a pedestal and we're like, that's what it looks like when you make a movie like that. It's hard to believe that's his first film ever. That's crazy, right out of the gate. I think that Smoke Signals is a testament to what can happen when we're given autonomy to tell our own stories and to tell it the way we want it. But it sucks that to this day, to tie it back into the movie, the doc makes it seem like there's this new wave of indigenous film and storytelling, and we're still waiting for that. Unfortunately, there's been a few kind of instances where we've had wins, but overall, we're still waiting for that next wave. And the trickster kind of downfall really doesn't help things.
Yeah, it's so tough. I think it's so hard to sell native content. It shouldn't be, but I think people who are decision makers in the industry, it's so hard to sell them on native content because most of them have never met a native. Most, especially when it comes to like native comedy and native joy, that is just completely foreign concept to a lot of these decision makers. And I've heard we're supposed to be getting a native sitcom within the next year or so, and I hope that's so. I hope I'm accurate. But it's going to
be produced by Bird Running Water and Ava DuVernay, and it's called Sovereign. Yep. That's I'm looking forward to that. I'm hopeful. You can't. I try to not be too jaded anymore. Of just like, I'm not going to condemn things. I'm not going to call for things to be canceled. I'm very much like, and I think it's influenced by this film, where I love the grace that Neil Diamond demonstrated in that, Kara alluded to it a bunch of times, and just like, he didn't condemn anybody. He just pointed it out and said, okay, I've laid it all out. Now it's up to you to make a decision for yourself on what you think. And that's what I hope to do with my show. And I hope to do with my perspective. And I try to mature into that voice because I think that calls for better, that that allows you to have more productive conversations with people.
I absolutely agree, and that's the education part. And I think, especially for people who are affected, like it's very easy and not right or wrong to get passionate and to have feelings about it. But when we're able to find that grace and that education while maintaining the passion, while maintaining the ability to tell these stories and to shine a light on it, I just think that's what's gonna get people to understand. And I'm really passionate about that approach as well.
What about you, Kara? See you
Uh,
smiling over there.
Just yeah, overall for the Real Injun film, I think I mentioned when we first started the conversation, it's such a great tool. It really bridges a lot of gaps for folks that haven't taken in a lot of Native film, who maybe don't have a good understanding of how we got here, how a lot of the world sees us as this sort of caricature. Um, and you're right, Neil Diamond, he definitely, he didn't shame anybody. He didn't put anybody down for, you know, what it was and, you know, how things were, but they can change and we can do better and we can, you know, have films and projects that really reflect us and share our voices.
Mhm.
So yeah, I wish, and I kind of mentioned to you guys before privately, I've had some trouble over the years getting my non-native friends to watch the movie.
I'm glad you remembered to bring this up. Go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah, I think maybe they're afraid of what it's going to be. They're like, oh, like it's like, you know, people have a hard time looking in the mirror. But the
Mhm.
thing is that the mirror that we're holding up, or that the film holds up, is not showing you your ugly reflection. It's just showing you a reflection.
Yep.
It's not there to make you feel like horribly guilty. Um, and you know, sometimes there are spaces where maybe you should feel a little guilty about whatever.
Yep, I agree.
Yeah.
I think that so what you bring up is a good point, because and I try to be empathetic, just like, yeah, white people, non people of color, people who are, have that kind of privilege, quote unquote, that who we put under that umbrella term, their entire lives, but at least in the past like 20 years, they've been getting shit on for things their ancestors have done that they necessarily might have never done. And I have a lot of friends who fall into that category in college and post college, and they get kind of exhausted by it, of just like another one of these movies to tell me how shitty my people were. I'm not going to go watch that. And I wish people would give Real Engine a chance, because it's not really that. It is, but it's not directing it toward people. It's toward the film industry. It's toward what their actions were, and how it frames your perception of maybe like, hey, you remember you asked me if I live in a teepee. This is probably why you asked me that question. And
Yeah.
it lays it out. And I would love for more people to see this. What do you think, Kaylee?
Yeah, I think it does an amazing job of saying, like, hey, you might think this one thing and here's why.
Mm-hmm.
And here's another way of thinking about it. And I will never stop recommending this film. I wish this film was actually expanded into maybe like a mini series, because I don't know if that would make
I
it more
agree.
appetizing, but I would watch it for sure. But I think it's just really like a great introduction. But yeah, and it's I think it's easy to consume. Well, ish. There are
Yeah.
some hard parts, I guess. But yeah, I will never stop recommending it. I can't recommend it enough. It's just so important to understand how all this became, and why it is the way it is, and why we're still facing some of the same problems we are now, and why our joy isn't on display as much as it should be.
I agree. And I think when it comes to, I get that question a lot too for this show. People will write in, do direct message, like DMs on Instagram or email, and be like, I'm not native, but, and then they kind of preface their comment. But then there are some people too that will say, like, is it okay for me to listen? You know, when coworkers hear that I have a podcast, or my friends that are non-native, like, hey, I'm not native, is it okay if I listen? And I don't know what that is. And for people that are listening that are non-native, why do you feel that way? Because I'd love to, you know, I'm not going to tell you to come on the podcast, but I would, you know, gladly read your response and keep you anonymous, because I think that's an interesting thing for native people to understand, of like, what are we doing that is preventing you from having a productive conversation, or what can we do to help you really just have an honest conversation with us? And some people will say, Ian, that's not our job to be able to do that, to have to do that. And I'm just like, hey, you know, for me, this Indian, this native Ian, it's going to be my job. Like, I want to have productive conversations. I want people to be honest and vulnerable with me.
Yeah, I think again, just part of the problem is most people not having a lot of, who are non-native, not having a lot of exposure to natives, either in their actual real lives or in mainstream media.
Right.
And so like they feel like, well, I can't relate to that. Or and then maybe some people, maybe their thought is, well, maybe that's a safe space for them, and I don't want to intrude on a safe space.
That's a great point. That's a great point. That's probably, there's probably a lot of truth to that. Maybe the majority of people. You know, I the whole reason I want to do this podcast was just to have one native's experience with their experience watching these movies. And I always say, if you don't like my voice, if you don't like my show, you don't like my content, that's okay. I'm not making this for everybody. And that's why, you know, a good segue to your show. That's why you can listen to other Indigenous people's podcasts like Twindigenous. So you two started a podcast called Twindigenous. Can you talk a little bit more about why a podcast?
Yeah, I don't even remember, like, this it all came together pretty quickly, and our fourth episode came out today. But yeah, Kara and I for a while have like just been saying, like, we should do something together. We should do this. And we've said, like, before, we should have a podcast, but we never knew what it would be. And I had just had a random memory one day of, I remember back in college, and this was like a while ago. I'm not trying to age myself, but it was a while ago. And we found out that there were people calling us the Twindians behind our back. And these were non-native people. And we're like, and we hate being called the twins, you know, and we hate being called by non-native people like the Indians or whatever. And
it's pretty damn clever though. That's a really good play on words.
I had to give it to him. I was not happy, but I was like, damn, that's clever. But we found that out, and something reminded me of it one day. And I thought, like, well, what if like the word was indigenous instead? And I thought, oh, Twindigenous. And I talked to Kara, like, well, what would it be about? And we both love pop culture and always have, and not so much like the gossipy side, but like more like pop culture history and the societal impact of pop culture. But we're also interested in, you know, native cultures and native history. We thought, what if we brought those two things together, where we pick a theme and we tell stories from both worlds and find how they compare, how they don't compare. And so, yeah, we've just been having some really interesting, well, I think they're interesting conversations about the intersection of mainstream pop culture and various elements of different native cultures. And native perspectives, and I've been really enjoying it so far.
Yeah, I have too. It was really Kaylee's baby, and I have obviously been very happy to come along for the ride.
Nice.
But she definitely, I was nervous about it. I am always nervous. I'm a nervous Nelly. But she really, like, you know, pushed me, like, come on, let's do it. We can do it. And for years, people have been telling us, you guys should have a radio show, because we play off of each other well.
Right.
But yeah, it's been a lot of fun to take different pieces of history, culture, today's pop culture, and view it through our unique lens, whether that's just our experience as people, our experience as Native women. It's been really fun. I think it's a fun show.
So I listened to your first episode, and I agree, it's fun. You do play off. I mean, obviously you spent your whole lives together, and the competition aspect that you're talking about, Kaylee being 4 minutes older than Kara, like, it definitely shows on camera. You're very playful. And it sucks that you two aren't together in person. I will say that I'm sure, like, when pandemic is done, it will be better. Not better, but more frequent. You two can get together. But I think it's just the beauty and kind of the hindrance of Zoom is like the ability to not see each other in person. So I hope one day we get to all meet in person and get to hang out and record an episode at some point. But I just really want to say thank you so much for coming on. And yeah, everyone listen to Twindigenous and tune into their show, and you'll really enjoy it. It has a lot of what I don't do, but it's a lot of the great things that, you know, I just don't have time for, that I don't get a chance to talk about. And thankfully there are other Native people doing awesome things, and Kara and Kaylee are two of those people doing that. So go check out their show. All right, everybody. Talk to you later.